I clap too because that is for my beloved wife, my Sarah, who works with Adobe Photoshop and sometimes even does stuff that's legal. If you're interested in the technology, and it is of interest, that's Apple's magnificent keynote presentation program. The reason we do Apple is because way back in '85, when we were making our first decisions on the Bible, as in all major decisions in our life, on our computer, first computer, we went to the Bible and couldn't find PC mentioned anywhere, but Apple was mentioned about a half dozen times. Made the decision very simple. And as we continued our research, we found that in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 3, there was a warning from God that the days would come when those who look through the windows will see dimly. So, read the Bible and does what it says. Let me pick up, I'm going to watch my time and stay very tightly on schedule. Let me pick up keywords there. Matrix. Maybe that's the most important word for me of everything. It goes back to a time after I gave some presentations on Roman imperial theology, signing books afterwards. The lady gave me a beatific smile and said that was lovely background. And somehow the tone or something made it quite clear she meant it was also kind of irrelevant. So I'm not talking foreground and background, because foreground and background are not interactive, not necessarily interactive. I say whatever I'm going to say in this foreground, no matter what's back there. I don't even want to say text and context, because we've been magnificently adept at focusing on text and ignoring context for 2,000 years. I want a single word that has no other word to confuse it. Matrix. It's not a weird term. I'm really not trying to introduce an esoteric term. It's what we all take for granted in wherever we live. If we hear something, we know what's going on. If we find the word Obama mentioned, we know the Matrix. If we came maybe from, I don't know, somewhere else, we might say, who he? If I'm watching television somewhere in Delaware and there's something going on and I don't know the Matrix, I don't know what the big issue is. Everyone else does. So Matrix is kind of common sense. It's everything that's taken for granted in the first century when they know what they're talking about. Now, I'm not trying to send us back into the first century to live there. I am taking us back to the first century so I know what they're saying. And then when I know what they're saying, I can, for the first time, decide to accept it or reject it. Up to that point, I literally don't know what is being said. And it's as sad and silly to take it all literally and love it, or to take it all literally and reject it. If somebody says to me, I think President Obama is an eagle, that's a metaphor. I think I know what's being said. If somebody says, no, I think he's a chicken, I also recognize a different metaphor. It's not about claws and feathers, though. We know that. We get the metaphors, so we know what the debate is. Matrix simply gets us back there so we can know what's going on. That's all. So the matrix actually is to put Jesus or Paul or anything in the first century back within their native Judaism, within, which means against, Roman imperialism. And I want to put it in the wider framework of what I'm going to call original sin. Because the first time that sin is ever mentioned in the Bible ain't in that garden. It's in Genesis chapter 4 when God says to Cain, the sin is crouching at the door, but you can beat it. You could beat it. And sin, if you read that chapter, is about escalatory violence. Nothing about sex in there at all. So let me look a little bit at Rome. What is the minimum we have to know to understand the matrix? In Greco-Roman theology, they took it for granted that of course there was immortal gods up there, and they could come down here and act like human beings. They could put on human flesh and blood, as it were, like you and I might put on clothes. Were they human? Of course not. Any more than if you and I were putting on a costume for Halloween or something, we wouldn't be that person. But they also believed, accepted, and took for granted that certain human beings, whose job description is that they had done something of extraordinary, transcendental value for the human race, could be raised to divine status. Now, if we don't like that language, that's all right. They like it. That's where their way of saying, for example, that Caesar, after 100 years, 80 of savage civil strife and 20 years of savage civil war, you know, ours was bad enough for 4. They had 20 years of it. Had brought peace. They didn't say to Italy or Rome or the Med. They said to the world. He brought peace to the world. If that didn't make him divine, what do we need them for? Gods are supposed to bring peace. Thank God for peace, but we're thanking Caesar. He is divine. Now that's their language. We can say, if we don't think human beings can be divine. But that's their way of saying, this person has done something of transcendental value for the human race and has thereby manifested the divine, revealed the divine. If we got into a debate with them today, they'd say, well, what would you call somebody like that? And we'd say, well, a genius. They say, what do you mean by a genius? We'd say, well, you know, somebody who does something of transcendental value for the human. Okay, we call that divine. You call it a genius. Big deal. Neither of us can explain it. So that's the important thing. You're talking about a real human being who've done something of transcendental value for the human race. That's the matrix they take for granted. Secondly, as I touched on this, they've gone through 100 years of civil strife when if you had bet, you'd say the Roman Empire is finished. In fact, Horace said, we started with Romulus killing Remus, we're a fratricidal brood, and we're finished. That was in 40 BCE. We're finished. We're at it again. We're a murderous, fratricidal people. And then came Caesar. And of course, it was the last round of a civil war. But at the end, he was victorious. And there was peace. And there was peace. Because the great genius of Rome was to invent territorial empire. Instead of a tributary empire, when the army is stationed at the capital city and go wherever it has to go, and the periphery is kind of running its own affairs, like the Persian Empire, Rome came up with this brilliant idea. What if we put the legions on the periphery? What if we based them all the way around the Danube, the Rhine, the Euphrates, the African front? We'd have peace. Inside this cordon sanitaire, we'd have peace. And yes, you could see it. Don't think I'm mocking Rome. I'm describing it. You could see the peace. If you were in Ephesus or any of the great cities, you didn't see legions beating up people. They were on the periphery. Inside was peace. Now, how could you even oppose such a vision? It's so empirically obvious. It worked. And Rome would have said, we didn't invent this idea of peace through victory. They would have said in Latin, duh. Isn't it obvious? Has there ever been peace any other way? So even to conceive there might be another way was already a brilliant step. And this is what's coming out of covenantal Judaism. There is another way. Because Judaism has been around long enough and its memory is long enough that they've seen the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Macedonians and the Romans come but not yet go. So where is God and empire? Are they on a collision course? But what's the alternative? So now we're moving into we're moving into Judaism, into covenantal Judaism. And what we're trying to understand is, where did anyone in this whole history of the world come up with such an absolutely counterintuitive idea, totally empirically unverifiable, that there is a God who cares about distributive justice? Where do you see that? How could anyone even conceive of it? It certainly is not something you'd ever learn looking around the world. But out of Judaism comes this weird idea. that God wants a fair share of all the world for all the people of the world. Try and hear the absurdity of it. And where did they get it? Let me just pick up one of the words from your family. Here's where they got it. They didn't get it by thinking about democratic rights or civil rights or human rights. That was not the way they were thinking. What they were thinking of something that everyone experiences or should experience. What is a well-run household like? Start down here on the earth. If you're walking into an agrarian household in the 1st century, let's say you're coming in and you're kind of sizing up the householder. Okay, you look at the fields, everything looks good. You get to the courtyard, then you're looking at the draft animal. Everything still looks good. Well fed, looks like they're taken care of. Then you see the children, fed, sheltered, clothed. Do you get the impression that a sick child will get special care and a pregnant mother will get special concern? At the end, then, reluctantly or not, you will praise the name of the householder. That's where they got it. They imagined God as the householder of the world house. They simply took that human experience that everyone should have and took it up to a transcendental level. God is the householder of the world house. Now, supposing you went into a household down here on earth and found some of the children starving and others overfed. What would you think of the householder? Be that householder a monarch or a peasant? How horrible. Should not all the children be taken away? So how embarrassing for God to be running a household that looks like this. That's really the way they're thinking. How embarrassing for God. Now, in the side, a footnote. Since we're dealing with a patriarchal society, then, and of course still, as we all know, we just don't talk about it now, it's gone underground. They imagine the householder as the father. So it will not begin our householder who art in heaven, but our Father who art in heaven. But don't get hung up on that. You can, with complete integrity, cross out father everywhere you find it in the Bible, put in householder. Don't quite put in parent or even father and mother. That's not quite the way they're thinking. That's householder. And it's a patriarchal delusion because if you know anything about the Mediterranean and you think fathers run the households, then you don't know the Mediterranean. Even a band called ABBA writes a musical called Mamma Mia, not Papa Mia. And even a sadder fact, recent scholarly work between groups working, I think it's Princeton and Stanford, on the statistics and demography of the 1st century across all classes, rich and poor, is as follows. Women were marrying at 13, First Men says. Men were marrying at 26. General life expectancy, now we're talking statistically, demographically, was 29 to 30. Start doing the math, as they did. They calculated a massive consensus on this, and I consider scholarly consensus technically to be called a miracle. That 1 in 3 children was fatherless by 15 in the entire Roman Empire. 1 in 3 was fatherless, which might explain a lot about Jesus being called Son of Mary, and my mother, my brothers, that Joseph was long dead. So sometimes when I hear all this fuss about father in the Bible, I don't see patriarchy, I hear nostalgia. And as long as I'm on that subject, with son, again, with complete integrity, you can cross out that word and put in what word? Heir, H-E-I-R. In that patriarchal world of male primogeniture, where the family farm or the kingdom is given to the firstborn son. There might be a daughter, the son gets it. Of course it's patriarchy. Of course it's patriarchal imperialism, if you will. But what it means is heir. The fuss about Jesus is that Jesus is the heir, or put in other language, that everything that God is, you can see in Jesus, you can get through Jesus. And Paul, in chapter 8 of Romans, tells you exactly what that means, and tells you, us, that we are co-heirs, not sub-heirs, or para-heirs, or meta-heirs, or any other type of heirs. Co-heirs with Christ to still the groaning of creation. So you can, with complete integrity, put householder where you see father, and heir where you see son. Now, that's the Roman situation you see. Clashing with this is another vision. And I want you to be surprised. And these are empirical observations, not theological maxims slipped in. That the Jews ever survived. Where are the Moabites, or the Edomites, or the kilobytes, or the megabytes, or all the other? I mean, these people were not destroyed. They simply melted into the gene pool of the Middle East. They're there somewhere if you want to do DNA. But this, I was going to say, pipsqueak little people, this tiny little tribal group, hung on. And maybe what they hung on was because they had this absolutely absurd idea that justice somehow ruled the world, despite all appearances and all evidence to the contrary. Let me pick up another word. Eschatology. You all heard of it, unfortunately. It's a word that we scholars have mystified beyond all human understanding in the last 20 years. It's one of our finest achievements. It is in itself a very simple word. Here's what's going on. You've got this experience on the one hand, which you can see in Daniel chapter 7, empires, 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 and now up to the 1st century we got the Romans. They're not going away, and they're not getting weaker, they're getting stronger. So when's God going to do something about it? How can you go on believing that God is just, that God is in control of the world, your God is in control of the world, when it is clearly obvious that the world is unjust and you're getting far more than your fair share of its injustice? Every empire you know of has its boot on your neck. And now you got the Romans. They're not getting weaker. You thought Alexander's phalanxes in Daniel 7 again were the worst thing you could imagine. All you could say, well, they're different, they're different. And then you got the Romans. So an intense occupation, an intense emphasis in the 1st century that surely God is going to do something now. And if not now, when? And if not now, why? And how long can you go on with this expectation when empires are getting stronger and there's no evidence of God's great cleanup of the world? Eschaton is a simple Greek word. It means the end. End of what? If you're in Athens airport and you're looking for the end of a ticket line and you ask somebody pour eschaton, you ain't inviting an eschatological debate. You want to know where's the end of the line. So end of what is the point? End of what? It is not about the end of the world. And if you read any scholar who tells you that, that scholar is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because we can think about the end of the world because, again, we're working to do it as fast as we can get there. We can conceive of it because we know how to do it. Atomically, biologically, chemically, demographically, ecologically. A, B, C, we're only up to E. We barely got going. We know how to do it. We know how to do it. But nobody in the Jewish world could imagine God ending the world and us going off to heaven or whatever. Because how embarrassing for God to have to admit that creation was a mistake. You know, calling the world back to the factory, as it were. There was the deluge thing, but God promised never to get that. Try that one again. So the end of the world, I think, was not conceivable in the way it is for us. What was conceivable, not only conceivable, but absolutely necessary to sustain your faith in a just God and an unjust world like creation, was that someday God's going to clean up the mess of the world. And as you may know if you've read anything I've written, that is my translation of eschatology, the great divine cleanup of the world. It's about extreme makeover, cosmic edition. That's what it's about. Now, with gathering intensity then, and you can see why. The Romans are here, and it doesn't look like they're going away. When's God going to do it? And John the Baptist said, God's going to do it any day now. God is coming with like an axe to be laid to the root of the tree. God is coming to burn the chaff with fire. This is an avenging God. But it's a God who's going to do it in an act of transcendental intervention. You can get ready for it. You can prepare for it. But you certainly aren't going to do it. It's a violent God coming intervention. My way of summarizing it is, John the Baptist said, the eschatological train is entering the station. Be on it or be under it. Jesus' vision, and this is not really a cheap exaltation of Jesus over John, because I think Jesus learned a lot for what John said and did and what happened to John. Because John expected God to come and clean up the world, and what came was Antipas's cavalry, and John was killed, executed as a martyr, and God did nothing. Was it really that difficult to move up the date a little bit? And was it adequate to pick up the fallen banner of the Baptists and say, well, we just got the date a little wrong. Next week maybe, or next month. I think Jesus watched, Jesus learned, and Jesus changed. Because he started his life as a follower of John the Baptist. That's as certain as anything historical ever can be about Jesus. You can see it in the diffidence in which the New Testament tells the story. Mark is willing to say he was baptized and let it go. Matthew has almost an argument about who should baptize whom. Luke says it's so fast that if you're not reading carefully, you can miss it. When everyone's being baptized, you do. I think it's about one word in Greek. And John, of course, John's Gospel finally gets it right and leaves the whole thing out. There is no baptism of Jesus in John. So I think it's clear. But then when we see Jesus speaking with his own voice, he's saying stuff like, the greatest person that ever lived on earth was John the Baptist. What? The least in the kingdom of heaven is greater. You never get him denigrating John. You never get him agreeing with him. That's exactly how you handle a revered mentor once you've graduated and started to think for yourself. After you've graduated, always. So what's the difference? It's not enough to say, well, Jesus has a nicer personality. He's a kind of a kinder, gentler form of violence. No. I think what we have to face is that Jesus' vision is different. But I think he changed because he saw God doesn't seem to be operating like that. Maybe we got it wrong. Maybe, I think Jesus is thinking. John is talking about an intervention, and God is waiting for a collaboration. What if, my language now, what if we're dealing with a collaborative eschatology? What if God is waiting for us while we're waiting for God? So nothing is happening. Like two people on a date waiting at different restaurants. Never going to happen. That is the message of Jesus, as clearly I can see it, having spent my life thinking about Jesus. You have been waiting for God, and God has been waiting for you. Put on that same metaphor, you are the eschatological train, and God has laid down the tracks from of old. Now, a train without tracks, or a tracks without train, equally useless, equally decorative. So Jesus' challenge is, imagine people hearing this for the first time. Where's that in the tradition? It's not in the tradition. My language again, it's a paradigm shift within the tradition. It's a paradigm shift within the tradition. It's a collaborative eschatology. Somebody's saying, you mean if we do nothing, nothing? It's not like the kingdom is here, we should get with it. But it's here in any case. No, it's not. It's not here like this hall is here, we can leave and come back and the hall is still here. It's only there insofar as you enter it. So on the one hand, everything depends on God, and on the other hand, everything depends on us. That is the message of Jesus. And nowhere do I know it has been summed up better in a one-liner, better even than Jesus's, and he's good at one-liners. Is Bishop Desmond Tutu, speaking in All Saints in Pasadena, California in 1999, summed it up like this: God without you won't, you without God can't. That is, I think, the most perfect summary I've ever heard of the message of Jesus. Let me conclude. Back to entertainment. We're in the election year, in the process, and I never make political statements. But I just want to draw your attention to two pieces of data from the Bible, and please feel free to use them without any attribution. Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, not an elephant. It doesn't tell you what's in the Bible. I mean, if you don't like the Bible, take it up with God. Secondly, all over the New Testament, maybe half a dozen times, it's mentioned that Jesus is seated at the right hand of God. Remember, I was talking about the heir. We talk about the heir apparent. In the ancient world, how did the heir become apparent? How did you know who the heir was? The queen sat in royal protocol. The queen sits to the king's left. The heir sits to the king's right. That's how the heir is apparent, if you got a coin or something. So Jesus is to the right of God. If the New Testament then is to be believed, as all good Christians do, then clearly God is to the left of Jesus. So if you want to find God, you first find Jesus and keep moving to the left.
Presented the check.
Oh, when a speaker, can you hear me? I told John that when a speaker is given the check before, it's faith. Given in the middle, it's hope. Given at the end, it's charity.